loved it. Thank you. Rob, we'd like to welcome you to OPAL. OPAL is a special place in the world, and especially on this part of the interwebs. OPAL is the 21st Senior Center in Baltimore County Department of Aging, and it's unique because there's no brick and mortar. So we are virtual and we do this all the time and go to virtual field trips and have a host of speakers. So we're excited that you are going to bring to us homesteading, women's suffrage, and the Wizard of Oz. Did you want to share with you your disclaimer about the show, if you will?
Yeah, so thank you for being flexible. The initial person to do the program unfortunately couldn't make it today, and so I'm stepping in. I am not a musically inclined person, my colleague is, and so I'll be shifting our program's focus away from the Wizard of Oz and a vocal rendition of Home on the Range, which is a part of that program traditionally, and more thinking about women's suffrage from a macro scale lens and how it is bound into the Homestead Act. And as a part of that caveat, I'm also happy to shift in the program towards people's curiosity. And I'll offer some avenues into that. And I deeply appreciate being here. As an aside, I also love working with adult audiences because we can have these conceptual conversations that are emergent rather than following a strict track through a program. So my understanding, of course, is that you guys have been doing a lot of digital work, and that's terrific. And so before I begin, I just want to set out some caveats and some suggestions. One is that I will have the chat open the entire time, and I can field questions at any time during our conversation today. A second part is that if you have questions that you're uncomfortable asking in a shared setting, I want to honor that too. And so you can always email me. My email is behind me there. I'll show it a couple of times today, but I love to follow up on questions that you may have, or if there's a question that I can't answer today, I'll do research and provide the answer grounded in secondary scholarship and provide that to you if you email me as a follow-up. And then finally, I will ask you all a lot of questions today, because one of the things that I think is powerful about national park sites is that the meaning of parks and the significance of parks and the stories they tell are emergent from dialogue. That is, it takes a conversation to fully pull out their significance. And so I'll ask a lot of questions. If you have a response, please answer in the chat. And yeah, with that, I'm thrilled to be here.
And Rob, may I impose one more? And please, again,
Course.
no is a complete statement because we had to pivot. And thank you for your grace again. We can also make our own inferences and connections based on your material as well to the Wizard of Oz. So that part I don't think needs to be lost.
Yes, that's correct. And so I know enough to get in trouble in that space, if you will. But before I begin today, I always love to situate the national park system as an entity in the United States, because there are 433 national park sites around the United States. I'm guessing that everyone here has visited at least one national park, if not more. And there's a lot of diversity to that system. From the significant natural sites, places like Saguaro or Yellowstone, to cultural sites and historical sites. For example, like Manzanar National Historic Site, which is a former Japanese-American internment camp, to a place that I have worked at, Mount Rushmore, which is, of course, both a heritage site for the United States as well as a contested space by the Lakota peoples. And so the way that I like to sum up the diversity of the national park system, and the map behind me here is that park system, is that national parks tell national stories. They tell stories not only about the United States as a nation, but also the nations within North America that are interacting with the United States, as well as nations farther afield that were nonetheless bound into North America as it takes shape and is expressed today across the present scene. Your colonial powers, indigenous powers, and of course the United States' power. And so the national story that I would like to tell today is that of the Homestead Act of 1862 as it is represented at Homestead National Historical Park. And so a question for the room here, has anyone been to Homestead National Historical Park?
Jackson, you did great. Reference a recipe to something that I need you to scan for me.
Ms. Martin, if you can turn off or turn your mute, that would be appreciative.
So Anita suggests no in the chat there. And most people do not come to Homestead. We are a relatively small National Park Service site that gets around 40,000 visitors a year, which seems like a lot, but then you can compare it to other national park sites around the country that receive millions in a year. And we are located just outside of a small town called Beatrice, Nebraska. The map behind me here has the approximate location of Homestead National Historical Park in southeastern Nebraska, represented by that red star. And then I like to use this map too, because it begins to allude to the national character of the story being told at Homestead National Historical Park. We're looking at a choropleth map. That is one where you have colors representing categories of things. And behind me, we have brown states and we have green states. And all of the states in brown are places that had homestead claims filed upon them. All the places in green did not. Now, the Homestead Act is a law signed into effect by Abraham Lincoln. And it says this: if you were 21 or the head of household, if you were an American citizen or had a pathway towards citizenship, and if you hadn't borne arms against the United States, then you could apply for up to 160 acres of the federal domain. And that 160-acre claim would become yours after you built a house on it, after you improved the land, which in the 1860s was understood as establishing a farm of a certain number of acres, and if you lived on the land continuously for 5 years in the presence of witnesses who could attest to the fact that you had been there. There was also a small filing fee assigned to filing a claim, which was $18 in the 1860s, which is equivalent to around $500 today. That becomes a national story with the establishment of the Act in 1862 and its initiation in 1863, and the first homestead claim is filed on January 1st, 1863 on our park grounds today. So the image that you see next to me is that of our park with the Heritage Center, our main exhibit center, there with the plowshare-shaped roofline. And the gentleman with the impressive beard above me is Daniel Freeman, upon whose land Homestead National Historical Park is situated. He filed his claim shortly after midnight when the law goes into effect on January 1st, 1863. Now, while we recognize Freeman and we tell the story of Daniel Freeman, it's Daniel Freeman as part of a wider movement that really is what puts Homestead on the map, because there are cascading effects of the Homestead Act that transform North America and US and indigenous societies. And we interpret those and tell the stories of those transformations here at our site. I'd like to offer a broad overview of each of these impacts before we dive into the experience of women in the Homestead Act. And I'd like to start with thinking through Abraham Lincoln's position when he establishes the Homestead Act of 1862. In 1862, the United States is embroiled in armed conflict with the Confederacy in the American Civil War. And Lincoln has a key concern, and that is, how do you keep Union states unified and in the Union, notably California and Oregon, which had enjoyed statehood at that point, but were separated physically from the rest of the Union. There is a front in the far west fought between the Confederacy and the Union during the Civil War. And California is under threat, as is Oregon. And so Lincoln thinks very strategically and says, hey, if we pass a law that incentivizes Western territories to stay in the Union because it offers a path towards statehood, this is a strategy that we can take to kind of build a land bridge between California and Oregon and the rest of the Union. And the Homestead Act is passed to incentivize people to follow Union laws in settling Western territories, with the implication that enough population in these territories developed by the Homestead Act will offer a path towards statehood. And by 1862, when the law is passed, late 1862, and when the law comes into effect in 1863, there's still a few years of the Civil War left to be fought, but the writing is already on the wall. And the Union anticipates winning this conflict against the Confederacy. And so they're already also anticipating the next set of conflicts that the United States is going to fight. And those are conflicts that have been ongoing throughout the entirety of the Civil War and predate the Civil War. And that's with indigenous nations that are on the ground in Western territories in the Great Plains. Behind me here, we have a map of indigenous nations across the United States with plains nations and plains people highlighted in green. The reason why I highlight those nations in our discussion today is because they are heavily impacted by the Homestead Act. And when we think of homesteading as a process of US expansion into the West, it is fundamentally a massive disruption to native lifeways. And so we recognize that in passing the Homestead Act, there are impacts to more nations than just the United States. Another impact that we recognize at Homestead is this. Part of the Homestead Act is grounded in this idea that predates the passage of the Homestead Act, that of the yeoman farmer. And part of the Homestead Act, to prove up, is in fact creating a farm out of whatever resources are on the land of a particular claim. And so you see ecological transformation. Has anyone had a chance to visit a tall grass prairie environment?
Yes.
Yeah. And some people not. If you have had that chance, you've walked in the rarest landscape on earth. And that's because tall grass prairie makes ideal farmland. And under the Homestead Act, 96% of it is plowed under. And wow, Ugandan tall grass prairie is also a highly threatened landscape. I am, in a past life, I was a geography instructor. I've never had a visitor or an audience member mention that, yes, there are tall grass prairie environments in other portions around the world. So thank you for that, Kathy, because that is a unique experience. With the Homestead Act, you see ecological transformation on a massive scale. And that's a legacy that we're coming to grips with today. If you visit Homestead National Historical Park today, and you walk our park grounds, it's no longer a working farm. It is a restoration of what was there and what was put to the plow. So we see ecological change as a major impact. Then we also can look to the language of the law and find a slew of socioeconomic changes in US society. Let's think of the language of the law. Just had to be 21 or the head of household to be a homesteader. There is no reference to sex or gender. And so to be a homesteader, you could be a woman and apply to become a homesteader. And that's really, really significant in the 1860s. Put a pin in that because we're going to return to that as the bulk of our program today. There's also no reference to race. And in the aftermath of the Civil War, a key question in US society is, what do you do with former slaves who are now free? And the Homestead Act is one of several moving pieces of legislation that are designed in part to offer a path for Black Americans to find an economic base in US society. Around 20,000 Black Americans file for homestead claims in the Great Plains and West. And that's a drop in the bucket for the total number of homesteaders in the US, but it is a significant form of generational wealth for the descendants of those Black homesteaders. And then you didn't have to be an American citizen to be a homesteader. And so if you had a path towards citizenship, you could apply to become a homesteader. Does anyone recognize this building here in the scene behind me here? It exists in a non-homesteading state. It is also a national historical park. I will answer that question in just a moment, Chastity. This is Ellis Island. Ellis Island is built in part to process the 16 million Europeans who arrived to the United States between 1870 and 1914. Many of them are seeking out homesteading opportunities in the United States and are arriving in response to advertisements that are sent to Europe to attract people to the Great Plains and West. Now, Chastity asked the question, hey, because of the fee, do freed slaves work together to file homestead claims? Yes. The short answer is yes. You find that one of the barriers to access is that $18.50 fee. And really, what you're looking at in the longer term is an investment of something that would be an equivalent to around $10,000 of equipment today. Your wagons, your farming equipment, and the like. And so a really common method amongst Black homesteaders would be to organize amongst the community and form extended family units to file claims. We have this myth of the homesteader as being sort of a pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of individuality. The reality is that teamwork and collaboration between individual homesteading households and other homesteading households is what really makes homesteading success happen, whether you're a Black American or an immigrant population with a link. We actually offer full programs on Black homesteading experiences that breaks down Black experiences of homesteading because they are slightly different from the general populace in how they are expressed and how that Black homesteaders conceptualize wealth, right? And a lot of it is grounded in mutual aid. Happy to geek out about that. It's one of my favorite programs to give. So back to thinking through immigration. right? Homesteading enables a pathway for immigrants to find a step up in US society. If you visit the Great Plains and if you've traveled through the Great Plains today, you'll find legacies of that. Your places like Lindsborg, Kansas, which celebrate Swedish heritage, or I'm located 15 miles from the Czech capital of the Great Plains, Wilbur, Nebraska. It's a town of approximately 2,000 people, right? You see the legacies of immigration all through the Great Plains and West as a part of the Homestead Act. And finally, we tend to think of homesteading as happening in the very rural communities of the United States. And if you are to drive through much of homesteading country, you'll find scenes like this, which is a photograph I took outside of the Black homesteading community of Nicodemus, Kansas. Cornfields. Yes, homesteading does transform rural development in the Great Plains and West, but it's also transforming urban centers in the United States that produce the commodities that homesteaders need. And so we see almost a second industrial revolution occurring in the United States to meet the demands of an increasingly mechanized agricultural base that are fundamentally homesteaders. Those are a lot of impacts. I offer all of them in a broad scope because I think that these are undeniably stories of multinational import, and that Homestead National Historical Park does belong within the national park system. I also offer them because I'm happy to field questions about those experiences and those impacts at any point during our talk today. But I would also now like to dig into the opportunities that homesteading offers women. And to do that, we have to establish ourselves in the 19th century prior to the Homestead Act and consider women's property rights in states across the United States. All those states in green that don't have homestead claims filed upon them, as well as some of the states that do have homestead states filed upon them, are, up until 1862, allowed to develop property rights for women as state legislation. What does this mean? What do you think property rights look like for women if it's decided at the state level?
We don't get any.
Yeah. Some states say there's none. Other states say only movable property. Some states say widows can inherit the property of their deceased husbands. Some states say, nope, has to go on to a primogeniture system, that is, passing on to men in the family. Some states offer more or less full property rights, and some fully restrict them. The diversity of state laws is a direct product of the lack of federal regulation of property rights for women. And the Homestead Act suddenly creates a federal precedent that states have to catch up to. Remember that you just had to be 21 or the head of household. What this means is that widowers could apply to become homesteaders. This means that single women who had not yet married could apply to become homesteaders. And this means that, orphaned women could also apply to become homesteaders. And women do. And now you have a whole lot of new relationships happening in US society in these territories of the United States that are not yet fully states. What kind of challenges are women homesteaders facing in the Great Plains in proving up on their claim. They might be shared by male homesteaders as well.
Are you wanting us to put it in the chat or say it as a audio?
I can accept both. And so whatever your comfort level is, I'm
Well,
happy.
since I'm unmuted, I imagine that I think of Little House on the Prairie, but
Yeah,
hardships, supply chain, the railroad hadn't been built yet all the way across, so getting access, there weren't roads set up for stagecoaches or whatever, and the railroad hadn't been set up, so the supply chain would be bad, harsh conditions, and you're there by yourself in some cases. Like the groups hadn't always been formed, right? So you don't know people, and nothing's established. There's no infrastructure.
this is why I love working with adult audiences, because you think structurally, right? Oh, you're right. There is a lack of infrastructure. There is the challenge of logistics, of getting things out to the homesteading frontier. And I use the term frontier as shorthand for just describing loose settlement patterns around the United States. There is isolation. Loneliness is something that people, women or men, are commenting on out in homesteading communities. There are environmental challenges. If you have to set up and establish a farm in 5 years, and 3 of those years are drought, well, you're up a certain creek without a paddle. And so, yes, there's the physical challenges of establishing a homestead. There's the logistical challenges, the structural challenges, the social challenges. And yet, women are proving up at the same rate as men, which the Homestead Act is in effect for 123 years. The rates of success vary through time. They also vary by geography. But the average rate of success is 50%. If you aggregate that across the entire expanse of the Homestead Act and both geographically and temporally. And so women are proving up. And once proving up, they're demonstrating really interesting things. I'm going to show you an image now, and we'll think about what it suggests about labor. This is a classic image from Willa Cather's My Antonia. What's going on here?
Are we plowing the field?
We are plowing the field.
Yeah.
And this is a task that prior to the Homestead Act, women were not expected to do. And so you see a change in the way that labor is taking place amongst these women homesteaders, because they're having to do work that was typically understood in 19th century society to belong to men. Conversely, single men are also having to do the labor on the homestead that belongs to, in the 19th century mind, women. And so suddenly you're seeing this blending of gendered labor expectations in the process of proving up on a homestead. And yet, these changes to labor and who's doing it suddenly is still producing successful homesteads, right? So women are proving up successfully, men are proving up successfully. There's mutual aid going on between homesteads, and women proving up successfully now have property rights. What do property rights suggest in the United States? What are some of the responsibilities of property owners?
Women could vote if they have property.
They couldn't vote yet.
Not yet. Okay.
Yeah. But property does imply something about political participation.
Is it taxes, Rob?
It's
Taxes.
taxes.
It's always taxes.
Always taxes, death and taxes, the two constants, right? And so women are paying taxes to territorial and state legislatures and legislative bodies and governments. And yet, as Alice has pointed out, they don't initially have the right to vote. Yet property taxes in US society is thought of as the fundamental base upon which people argue for franchisement. And so while the women's suffrage movement on the East Coast, in places like Seneca Falls, New York, another national park site, are being argued along ideological lines and value-laden lines of saying, yes, people are intrinsically equal, men or women, and so should have equal rights. It's women homesteaders who say, hey, I also have money in this game, and that's why I should have the right to vote. And so Eastern suffragettes begin to invite Western homesteading women to the East Coast to argue for homesteading access. And this is something, or to argue for suffrage, excuse me. And this is something that gains traction in Western territories, because there's an interesting thing happening in the 19th century mind in the American West about why women are a vital part of the American West. And to do that, I'd like to show you an image that I'm sure we have all seen before. And I'd like us to think about what parts of this image, or what this image suggests about 19th century American society. It's this. This is John Gast's painting. Has anyone seen this painting before? It's well known, and when taught in your American West courses in the United States at the university level or even high school levels, this is a painting that is widely recognized as a representation of a key idea in US society in the West. And I see Chastity is nodding. What idea is being represented here?
I nod with conviction, but I might be completely wrong. Is it and I forget the word, where there's a divine providence that this is what we're supposed to do? This is how we're supposed to expand.
Yes, manifest destiny.
There you
right?
go.
The idea that the United States is promoting since the 1820s on, right? Basically, once the US acquires the Louisiana Purchase, explores it, and realizes there's so many resources out there to take advantage of, it says, okay, we better go coast to coast, right, in our expression of power. And so this painting epitomizes that idea, that there is divine backing to US expansion across the West. What is striking about that image? What things come to mind if you haven't encountered this before? Or if you have?
That the divine figure is a woman.
Yeah. And that's tapping into a lot of interesting ideas that John Gast is a white man, right? Have about femininity in the United States. The American West in the 1800s is understood as wilderness. And the wilderness idea says that, wilderness is beyond the boundaries of American civilization. And sure, there might be people in the wilderness, but they're not American, and so they're not counted in this equation. And that in the project of manifest destiny, the United States must expand civilization into the wilderness. And if you look at language that the 19th century is using in describing what brings American civilization into the wilderness, they're really focusing on two institutions as symbolic of US expansion into the wilderness, as having established civilization there. One, the courthouse, and two, the schoolhouse. Why does that tie into the figure of the woman being outsized in this image? We can speculate here.
I'll take a stab.
Yeah.
So, Lady Justice, she kind of looks like Lady Justice, so that could kind of ring that. But then, and sadly, I'm being unfamiliar with this painting, I can't tell what kind of book she's holding. So, therefore, not only does she bring justice implied and education, and it looks like she's moving toward the Native Americans who are cowering in front, if you will.
Yeah, you've picked up on a couple of key interpretations of this painting. This is a representation of Lady Liberty, right? Which is clearly bound into ideas of justice. And you could even link that to deeper ideas of sort of Greco-Roman influences on concepts of justice. I mean, she's wearing a toga, right? And it is being brought to people who hadn't experienced those things before. This is a really loaded painting, right? There's also male figures surrounding them, surrounding Lady Liberty, if you will, right? The representation of the United States. And these are also forces shaping the wilderness. And there's two interesting dynamics going on. You mentioned and tackled the courthouse quite well by saying, yeah, there's linkages to justice. Schoolhouse is widely recognized as a woman's space, right? Where she is educating a populace. And so if a schoolhouse and a courthouse are symbols of civilization in the West, then a woman's presence in wilderness spaces is fundamentally bound into creating that space as an American space. Now, all of that language is actively being used by Americans in the 19th century, right? And yet women are sometimes explicitly engaged in that project and sometimes not. And then there's a more pragmatic dimension, which is that Western territories are still male-dominated spaces. And yet it was only deemed proper to marry white women in the 19th century if you were a white man. And so territories began to incentivize women to come out to these spaces and become homesteaders, simply so that there could be a marriageable pool of women out there. And so what ends up happening is that Western territories say, okay, how are we going to begin to market ourselves to women who could homestead anywhere where there's federal lands? Well, they begin to work with suffragettes or listen to suffragettes and advocate for the creation of suffrage in territorial legislatures. This process begins as early as the 1850s, prior to the Homestead Act, to just draw women out into Western spaces. But it largely fails. For example, prior to the Homestead Act, we end up having suffragettes moving from Seneca Falls out to places like Omaha and being invited to speak in these territorial legislatures and being invited to speak about suffrage and the opportunities that it affords, yet legislation dies in the House, if you will, at the state level. So above me here is Amelia Bloomer. Amelia Bloomer is a woman who grows up in Seneca Falls and becomes a suffragette by the 1850s and moves out to the Great Plains in the 1850s. And she is invited as a suffragette prior to the Homestead Act to speak to the legislative bodies of Iowa and eventually Nebraska. And she does. She explicitly speaks about women's rights. She's given the option to talk about anything, and she chooses to talk about women's rights. And this quotation behind me here suggests the reception of these early suffragette movements in places that are seeking to invite women out to these spaces. In mingling with the people next day, we found her argument had met with favor. As far as property rights are concerned, all seem to agree with the lady that the laws of our country are wrong. This is before the Homestead Act. And that women should receive the same protections as man. All we have time to say now is that Mrs. Bloomer's arguments on women's rights are unanswerable. We may doubt the policy for women to vote, but who can draw the line and say that naturally she has not a right to do so? Mrs. Bloomer, though a little body, is among the great orators of our time. And this is before the Homestead Act. But we see that Western territories are already thinking about passing property rights for women to attract women out to those spaces. And that the Homestead Act adds a new dimension that guarantees those property rights, but does not yet guarantee suffrage. It takes 14 plus years after Bloom's kind of pioneering talk in a Great Plains legislative body for suffrage to first be passed at the territorial legislature. And the subsequent state today still alludes to that moment in their motto. Does anyone know what state or what territory and then state passes suffrage first in the United States? Wyoming. Wyoming territory passes suffrage and then immediately begins to call itself a free territory. And then it passes suffrage again when it becomes a state. And that's a fought out battle too. Because you see in the women's suffrage movement in these Western territories that the territory will incentivize women moving out there to become homesteaders by passing suffrage. And then women homesteaders move out to those places. And the territory gains enough population to become a state. And it does. And then they try to pull back suffrage. And suffragettes say, we are going to still advocate for the clear economic base that we've established in these Western spaces. And so suffrage is a battle that is fought twice over in the transition from Western territory to Western state. And this happens time and again. Suffrage is actually passed like 3 times in Utah, right? And so you see that the women's suffrage movement does not have one point of victory. It is rather a battle that is being fought over time and in relation to shifting political identities of Western states. But it's Western states that lead the way in passing suffrage. What we see here is a map of the United States that, I know the key is relatively small, demonstrates women's voting rights temporally. So the different colors represent the year in which suffrage is passed. The darkest blue, Washington, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, is full voting rights before the 19th Amendment, as well as before statehood. So those territorial battles are being fought out. The middle blue are full voting rights before the 19th Amendment. Green offers partial universal suffrage in those states where women could vote for the president but not engage in state elections prior to the 19th Amendment. And then the yellow states are all those states that only enabled suffrage with the passage of the 19th Amendment. And so we see a real pattern here of west to east suffrage across the United States. And suffragettes know that. And they market it in eastern states. What we have here is another terrific image that I think is loaded with interpretations. This is called the awakening. What's similar and different from our previous painting here?
We've got a Lady Liberty type of figure instead of the celestial figure. She's still got the flowing robes and everything, but she's representing freedom rather than the judgment or the school
Yep.
educational thing.
Yep. Nailed it, right? You have a Lady Liberty figure moving eastward, and the states that are lit up by her torch, well, those are territories and states that had already passed suffrage, right? And so Eastern suffragettes say that this is the awakening of a wider movement that will bring equality of the sexes in the political realm to the United States. And here's where we see Kansas come into play. I can only speak about this in broad terms. But the reason why The Wizard of Oz as a work of fiction is bound into the suffragette movement is because of its representations of women and because of Frank L. Baum's explicit focus on the suffrage movement. He is a male figure who supports suffrage, and he marries a suffragette. And in The Wizard of Oz, the strongest characters are all women. You have your Wicked Witch of the West, you have your Good Witch of the East, right? And you have, of course, Dorothy, the Kansan, who is making waves in Oz, this sort of fanciful space that is also bound into discourses that we've already talked about, or ideas that we've talked about. And Antiem, yep. That is that women are an essential part of creating home, right? And so in The Wizard of Oz, just like this wider suffrage movement, we find a whole lot of seemingly disparate ideas begin to come together in advocating for women's rights. There's the 19th century demands for manifest destiny that begin to say women are a part of this because they are a part of that civilizing process of the wilderness. There's the pragmatic demands of Western territories seeking population growth to become states. And so they advertise suffrage in tandem with the Homestead Act to draw women westward. There's suffragettes who are seeking along value-laden lines, just equality of the sexes. There's also ideas of creating homes that cannot be understood divested of womanhood, right, in Western spaces. And so that's occurring across the West and Midwest. One minor example of that, which I forgot to show you today, is a poem written by a suffragette on homesteading. Here he came and built his house, and here he brought his bride. Here they lived and here they loved and reared their young with pride. From here they paid their tax and tithe, and here at last they died. Eager roots that plunge to dust that once was flesh and bone, send roses up to speak to those whose names are carved in stone, who gave their lives in way of life peculiarly their own. As dust can speak and flowers can speak, I, since my life began, have felt this drive within my breast to speak what words I can. For here they handed down to me their love for God and man. These are things that suffragettes mobilize in their quest for political equality in the West and Midwest as a part of the Homestead movement. And all of those ideas are to some extent expressed in the text of The Wizard of Oz, in the protagonists and their characteristics, in the ways that they relate to each other and to place. Chastity's epiphany is what I was driving at. Thank you. You've articulated it much better than me, right?
It's also interesting that the male figures in The Wizard of Oz are all fake, as the wizard is, or in the case of the lion, he doesn't have a heart or the brain, and those things are, missing and only found in the women figures.
Yes. And then to answer your question really broadly, Chastity, because there's reams of scholarship on this. Kansas at the time of The Wizard of Oz's publication is actually one of the most progressive, and I use that in early 19th century or early 20th century terms, states in the United States. It is a place that is oftentimes called Red Kansas because there's widespread socialist movements in Kansas in the early 20th century, where a part of that socialist movement is bound to gender equality, right? Saying that it's labor that defines who we are, not sex or gender, right? So I can offer some recommendations on books that connect to that. It's way outside of my area of expertise, but that's one reason why Kansas is so primed into that discussion. That wider progressive movement is also an expression of a reason why Kansas is a location for Black homesteaders to settle en masse. You can argue that the legacy of John Brown and the shadow of John Brown extends not only through the abolitionist movement, right, but also into that turn towards progressive politics in Kansas in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Another factor that explains that is the challenges of homesteading means that farmers turn towards government aid as a key way of navigating those challenges, right? And you find that Kansas is one of the first places to advocate for widespread government aid to ensure that farmers can retain their land, right? It's a story that the homesteading story feeds into so many different dimensions of US history: governance, equality of the sexes, racial dynamics, and the like, right? It's really one of those things that spirals out when you examine it in depth. I want to offer time for questions as well, because I recognize that I threw a lot at you. Before we do, thank you for being so flexible. I really appreciate it. And thank you for being such an engaging audience. I really appreciate that too. As Chastity mentioned at the beginning of today's conversation, a lack of responses can sometimes drive a program into the ground. So I felt buoyant because of this. So thanks so much. And I'd love to open things for questions. Anita, do you have one?
Yes, I'd like to ask you, he wrote the story in order to be able to change the current society at the time?
He wrote the story to embody a current of change that he espoused, right? Literature is very much a political tool.
Yes.
And Baum is savvy enough to know that if you write a great story, you drive your message home. Yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Of course, it's my pleasure.
Wow. Now, were women able to get loans?
That's a great question. I don't know. I will look that up and I'll pass along some book recommendations to Chastity via email, as well as if I can find that answer, I'll just include it as a side note.
I mean, that brings the question of how so many women manage to get the money together. Because, of course, if they hadn't had property previously, how would they have had property to buy into homesteading?
Yeah. One of the things that you find in single women homesteaders is that while they are proving up successfully, right, and they are the heads of household, women homesteaders and male homesteaders just are thinking through ideas of community and are being very strategic about who files a claim where. One common pattern that you find is that family units with a woman who would otherwise be dependent on that family all file claims together and adjacent to one another. So the father of a household would file a claim. The single daughter who might have stayed with him until marriage moves out, files a claim independently and adjacent to that household. And then you engage in mutual aid together to make those claims both prove up successfully, right? That's a fairly common practice. There's also multiple women pooling things together to file claims. One that comes to mind because there's photograph documentation of it, and it was regarded as significant, was a homestead, one of the first homesteads in Custer County in Nebraska, was filed by three sisters who were not bolstered by family, but they had worked labor jobs farther east to accumulate the money to file claims together, and they proved up together. Right? And then once you prove up, you've got 160 acres of land that is fixed capital that you can sell elsewhere.
That's the beginning of the Grange, which we still have today, where people combine together in order to be able to buy property and things and equipment, and then they share it because it's too expensive to buy really big equipment for one farm. So the Grange buys one and then they share it. And that's still going on today.
Yep. And I think that suggests something about the power of collaboration, right? Especially when facing logistical challenges and physical challenges.
Wow. Thank you so much.
May I put you on the spot for a second and ask you what other programming does the Homestead National Park offer? And what then I'm going to throw it back, not obviously right this space, but if there's something that kind of really sticks and resonates with you all, my dear members, I would just email me what sounded good to you and I can connect with Rob. Is that okay, Rob? Can I put you on the spot for that?
So I'm the education coordinator here on site. We offer a variety of distance learning programs through our CILC platform, which of course you are aware of. Some of our more popular programs include what's called Follow the Buffalo, which is a program that explores indigenous uses of bison. And when that program is given to adults, we not only explore how bison are used through material things, but also how the rise and fall of bison populations in the Great Plains is a political process, right? It's very much bound into indigenous conflict with the United States. And we explore how that plays out, or US conflict with indigenous peoples, right? And we explore how bison are not just a keystone species of the plains, and they're not just a resource. They are also a political animal. So that's one program I love giving. We talk about the Homestead Act and its impacts much more in depth, kind of an expansion of those big themes that I talked about. We also talked about Black homesteading experiences, particularly in Nebraska, but the transferable lessons of Black homesteaders in Nebraska and what their communities looked like, and the unique challenges and successes of Black homesteading experiences across the Great Plains. And then, oh, the women's suffrage program. And education and what a school day is like in the 19th century and how that changes over time. And so that's another one that we give, as well as just what a day in the life of a homesteader is like. Though, if I'm being entirely honest, that's very much more for younger audience groups, thinking through the individual challenges. A final thing is this. I am a huge advocate of creating customized programs based on the interests of the audience. It might take a little bit more to schedule, but if there's an idea that connects to homesteading that you want explored, we have the capacity to create that custom experience.
Thanks, Rob. You heard OPAL members. You have some homework to do. If you would like to revisit the National Homestead Park, please let me know. You can email me. And Rob, thank you. If you were a pinch hitter, it was not obvious. So thank you so very much. I just a selfish question because I am a big fan of The Wizard of Oz and its remakes and all of that. Is that could there be a 2.0 where maybe we can visit with the person who is not able to be here today and she can bring in that song element? I would love that personally. I don't know how everyone.
100%. It's one of her favorite programs to give. And oh, she's actually a very talented singer. And when we do school field trips on site or tour groups, if we need to have a pinch hitter, we throw in that ranger and she will introduce the Wizard of Oz and Home on the Range and usually engage in a sing along. So
Nice.
I encourage you to look up the lyrics before that happens. And yeah, if you just reschedule it again, we'll be sure to make that happen.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us too. We appreciate all that you are and just all that you do. So, Rob, have a great day.
Thank you
And
so much.
yeah, thank you all for being here. Take care.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Bye-bye.